The town of Hollow Grove was known for its quiet charm and serene landscapes. Nestled between dense forests and rolling hills, it was a place where nothing ever seemed to happen. But one cold October evening, everything changed. It started with a low, distant groan that echoed through the night air. Sheriff Miller, on his routine patrol, paused by the old cemetery at the edge of town. The sound was faint, almost a whisper, but it sent a chill down his spine. He shook his head, attributing it to his imagination, and continued his rounds. As the night deepened, the groaning grew louder and more insistent. By midnight, it had become a cacophony of guttural wails, piercing the eerie stillness. The first emergency call came from Mrs. Higgins, a widowed woman who lived near the cemetery. She claimed to have seen her deceased husband wandering through their yard, his eyes lifeless and his flesh rotting. Sheriff Miller rushed to her house, but by the time he arrived, Mrs. Higgins was nowhere to be found. The only trace of her was a trail of blood leading to the back door, which hung ajar. A sense of dread settled over him as he stepped inside, calling out her name. The house was eerily silent, save for the creaking of the floorboards under his feet. In the kitchen, he found a broken window and a smear of blood on the counter. Outside, the groaning had grown louder, closer. He grabbed his radio and called for backup, his voice shaking. "This is Sheriff Miller. I need all available units at Mrs. Higgins' residence immediately. We have a situation here." Before he could finish, a shadow moved at the corner of his eye. He turned, flashlight in hand, to see a figure stumbling towards him from the hallway. It was Mrs. Higgins, but she was no longer the woman he knew. Her eyes were clouded, her skin gray and decayed. She lunged at him with unnatural speed, and he barely had time to react. Sheriff Miller fired his weapon, the sound echoing through the house. Mrs. Higgins fell to the floor, but the noise had drawn the attention of others. From the darkness, more figures emerged, all in various stages of decay. The dead had risen, and they were hungry. He fought his way back to his patrol car, the undead closing in around him. As he sped away, he saw the once quiet town now teeming with the reanimated corpses of its former residents. The streets were chaos, screams filling the air as the living tried to escape the clutches of the dead. Sheriff Miller drove to the town hall, where a small group of survivors had gathered. Among them were Emily, the local schoolteacher, Mark, the mechanic, and Dr. Thompson, the town's physician. They barricaded the doors and windows, desperately trying to formulate a plan. "We need to get out of here," Emily said, her voice trembling. "There's no way we can fight them all." Mark nodded. "The gas station has a few trucks. If we can get to them, we might have a chance." Sheriff Miller looked around at the frightened faces. "All right, we make a run for the gas station. Stick together, and don't stop for anything." The group moved as one, darting through the dark streets, the groans of the undead all around them. They reached the gas station, but their relief was short-lived. The doors were locked, and the keys were inside. Mark smashed a window, reaching in to unlock the door. As they piled into the trucks, the undead swarmed. One of the survivors, a young man named Kyle, was grabbed and pulled into the horde. His screams echoed from their ears as they sped away, leaving him behind. The road out of town was blocked by abandoned cars and debris. They had to navigate a perilous path, the undead clawing at the vehicles as they passed. Dr. Thompson, driving the lead truck, swerved to avoid a group of zombies and crashed into a ditch. The survivors scrambled out, but Dr. Thompson was trapped. The undead closed in, and there was nothing they could do as he was dragged from the truck, his cries of pain cutting through the night. Desperation set in as they fled on foot, the undead relentless in their pursuit. They reached the outskirts of town, finding temporary refuge in an old barn. But the safety was fleeting. The groans grew louder, the undead closing in. "We can't stay here," Sheriff Miller said, his voice grim. "We need to keep moving." Emily looked at him, fear in her eyes. "But where can we go?" They're everywhere. We head to the mountains, Sheriff Miller replied. It's our only chance. As dawn broke, the survivors set out once more, the undead never far behind. The journey was harrowing, every step a fight for survival. They lost more people along the way, the relentless horde picking them off one by one. By the time they reached the mountains, only a handful remained. They found a cave and made it their new home, constantly on guard, knowing the undead would find them eventually. Sheriff Miller stood at the cave entrance, watching the sun set over the valley below. The town of Hollow Grove was lost, but they had survived another day. As night fell, the groans of the undead echoed through the mountains, reminder that the nightmare was far from over. They were living on borrowed time, each day a battle to stay alive. The dead had risen, and there was no escape.